In September 2016, British police tore apart a Greek farmhouse. On the penultimate day, a forensic officer's gloved hand emerged from the dirt holding a yellow toy car. Carrie Needham's breath caught when they showed her the photograph. Ben had that exact car. But when DNA results came back in 2018, they revealed the blood on the toy wasn't Ben's. What happened to Ben Needham remains one of Europe's most haunting mysteries. The phone at the hotel rang 3 times before Carrie Needham answered it. Her mother's voice came through the line, tight and strange. "You need to come home now." That was all Christine said before the line went dead. Carrie stared at the receiver, her chest tightening. Ben. Something about Ben. She grabbed her bag and ran for the door, not bothering to tell her supervisor she was leaving. The drive from the hotel back toward Iraklis felt endless, the afternoon heat shimmering off the single-track road. When she finally saw the farmhouse, there were too many people, neighbors, police, her father standing by the Land Rover with his head in his hands. She knew before anyone said the words, Ben was gone. But to understand how a child could vanish in 5 minutes from a dead-end track in the middle of nowhere, you had to understand how the Needhams came to be there in the first place. Sheffield, South Yorkshire. Early 1991. Carrie Needham was 19 years old, a single mother living in a dingy flat with her baby son. The flat had 1 bedroom, damp walls and windows that rattled when the wind picked up. Post-industrial England was deep in recession, and opportunities for a young woman with no qualifications and a toddler were scarce. She worked odd jobs when she could find them, but mostly she was alone with Ben, watching the days blur together in that dark little space. Her son deserved better. She deserved better. When her parents called from Greece with an idea, "Come join us, bring Ben, we'll start fresh," it felt like a lifeline. Eddie and Christine Needham had already made the leap. They'd sold everything they owned in Sheffield, bought a caravan and an old Land Rover, and driven across Europe to the island of Kos. Eddie was a builder by trade, and Greece was booming with construction work. The plan was simple: live cheap, work hard, save money, maybe buy a small house eventually, build something permanent. Christine had found them a spot for the caravan near Salidi, a coastal village where the rent was low and the sea was close enough to hear at night. It wasn't luxury, but it was theirs. And when Carrie arrived in April with Ben, the family was whole again. Ben Needham had been born on October 29, 1989, in Boston, Lincolnshire. He was a sturdy child, all blonde hair and blue eyes, with a strawberry-colored birthmark on the back of his neck that Christine said looked like a little heart. At 21 months old, he was walking, babbling, getting into everything the way toddlers do. He loved toy cars, the cheap plastic kind you could buy at any market stall. He'd push them through the dirt for hours, making engine noises, creating elaborate roads only he could see. His favorite was a yellow dinky car with black wheels. He carried it everywhere. Life on Kos settled into a rhythm. Carrie found work at a hotel, cleaning rooms and serving breakfast to tourists. The hours were long, but the pay was enough to contribute to the family pot. During the day, Ben stayed with his grandparents. Christine would push him in his buggy along the dusty roads, talking to him in English while the Greek world hummed around them. Eddie took odd construction jobs, mostly renovations for expats who wanted traditional farmhouses modernized. Stephen, Carrie's 17-year-old brother, worked alongside their father, learning the trade. It was hard work, but it was honest. They were building something. The farmhouse in Iraklis came to them through word of mouth. A couple wanted renovations, structural repairs, new plasterwork, maybe an extension eventually. The place was remote, accessed by a single-track, unpaved lane that wound through olive groves and scrubland. It was the kind of location where you could work without neighbors watching, where the only sounds were birds and the occasional bleat of a goat. Eddie liked jobs like this. No one breathing down your neck, no one complaining about noise. Just the work and the heat and the satisfaction of fixing something broken. Christine didn't love the farmhouse. It was too isolated, too quiet, and there was heavy machinery. An excavator brought in to clear land and move building spoil. She'd grown up around construction sites, knew the dangers. "I don't like Ben playing near that thing," she told Eddie one evening. Eddie waved her off. "He'll be fine. We'll watch him." And they did watch him. That was the terrible irony of it all. They were watching him when he disappeared. July in Greece is brutal. Temperatures climb past 30 degrees Celsius, and the sun bleaches the landscape white. Work happens in the early morning and late afternoon. Midday is for rest, for hiding in whatever shade you can find. On the morning of July 24th, 1991, Christine pushed Ben's buggy from the caravan to the farmhouse, same as always. Ben was in good spirits, pointing at things, singing nonsense songs. When they arrived, Eddie and Stephen were already at work. The excavator sat near the building, its yellow bulk dominating the site. The operator, a local man named Konstantinos Barkas, was already in the cab, maneuvering loads of earth from one area to another. Ben watched the machine with wide eyes. "Digger," he said, which was his word for anything big and mechanical. Christine smiled. "That's right. Love. Big digger." The morning passed. Ben played in his designated area, a patch of dirt near the farmhouse door, far enough from the excavator to be safe, close enough that Christine could see him from inside. He had his yellow car, and that was all he needed. He pushed it through the dust, making roads, creating a world. Stephen teased him, ruffling his hair when he passed by. Eddie checked on him periodically, smiling at the sight of his grandson so absorbed in play. Everything was normal. Everything was fine. At 12:30, the family stopped for lunch. They gathered inside the farmhouse where it was cooler, eating bread and cheese and fruit. Ben sat on Christine's lap, his face smudged with dirt, his little hands grabbing at food. Carrie had packed extra that morning. Sliced tomatoes, olives, a chunk of feta. Simple food, but it tasted good after hours in the heat. Eddie joked about the afternoon's work, something about a wall that wouldn't straighten properly. Stephen laughed. Ben babbled. It was just another lunch, just another day. No one knew it would be the last meal they'd all share together. The afternoon settled over the farmhouse like a heavy blanket. After lunch, the adults returned to their tasks, moving slower in the heat. Ben was released back outside, his white and green shirt already dusty, his leather sandals scuffed from the morning's adventures. He went straight to his yellow car, squatting in the dirt, resuming whatever game he'd been playing before the break. Christine watched him from the doorway for a moment, then turned back inside. Eddie was somewhere around the side of the building, hammering at something. The excavator's engine rumbled in the background, a constant mechanical heartbeat that had become as familiar as breathing. Stephen finished securing a load of materials and checked his watch. Nearly 2:30. He needed to run to the village for supplies, water, maybe some bread for tomorrow. He told his father he'd be back in 30 minutes, then walked toward the moped they'd brought to the site. As he swung his leg over the seat, he glanced back. Ben was there, right where he was supposed to be, playing in the dirt. Stephen could see the yellow car in the child's hand, see the concentration on his nephew's face. "Be good," Stephen called out, though Ben didn't look up. The moped's engine kicked to life, and Stephen rolled down the lane, dust rising in his wake. Christine was inside the farmhouse, organizing tools in the relative cool of the interior. The excavator was still working. She could hear it, that low mechanical growl punctuated by the beep-beep-beep of the reversing alarm. Eddie was out there somewhere. Ben was outside. Everything was accounted for. She wiped her forehead with the back of her hand, thinking about how they'd all need baths tonight, how much dirt Ben would have under his fingernails. She smiled to herself. That boy could find dirt anywhere. 5 minutes passed, maybe 10. Time moved strangely in the heat, stretching and compressing without warning. Christine stepped toward the door, intending to check on Ben, maybe bring him some water. She looked out at his play area. The yellow car was there, lying on its side in the dust. But Ben wasn't. She frowned. "Ben?" Her voice carried across the site, but there was no reply. "Benjamin?" She stepped outside, scanning the immediate area. He must have wandered around the corner, or maybe into the olive grove just beyond the building. Toddlers did that, saw something interesting and followed it without thinking. "Ben, love, where are you?" She walked the perimeter of the farmhouse, calling his name. The olive grove was sparse, easy to see through. He wasn't there. She checked behind the equipment, behind the piles of materials. Nothing. Her pace quickened. "Eddie." Her voice had an edge now, something sharp cutting through the afternoon air. "Eddie, where's Ben?" Her husband appeared from around the building, confusion on his face. "What do you mean?" He's playing out front. Christine's chest tightened. He's not. I can't find him. They searched together, both of them moving faster now, calling louder. The excavator had stopped. When had it stopped? And the silence felt wrong. Christine's mind was racing. He couldn't have gone far. He was just a baby, 21 months old. He couldn't have walked more than a few meters in the time she'd looked away. But the terrain was rough, full of dips and rises. What if he'd fallen? What if there was a hole somewhere? A well? Something they hadn't seen? Ben. Her voice was breaking now, panic bleeding through. Ben, please. Stephen returned on the moped, the supplies forgotten in the village. He'd gotten only halfway there before a feeling made him turn around. Nothing concrete, just a sense that something wasn't right. When he pulled up to the farmhouse, his mother was crying, his father white-faced. "What's happened?" Stephen asked, though part of him already knew. "It's Ben," Christine said, her voice barely audible. "He's gone. He's just gone." Stephen's mind went blank. He'd seen Ben 20 minutes ago. 20 minutes. How could a child vanish in 20 minutes? The three of them searched until their throats were raw from shouting. They covered every meter of the property, looked under every tarp, checked inside every container. The excavator operator, Barkus, joined them, his face grim. He said he'd been working the whole time, hadn't seen anything unusual, hadn't heard anything either, but the machine was loud. You wouldn't hear a child over that noise. Eddie's hands were shaking. Christine couldn't stop crying. Stephen kept returning to the spot where he'd last seen Ben, as if staring at it hard enough would make his nephew reappear. As the sun began its descent, painting the sky orange and pink, the reality became unavoidable. Ben wasn't hiding. He wasn't sleeping under a bush. He wasn't coming back from a toddler's walkabout. He was gone. Actually, truly gone. At 6 o'clock, Eddie drove to the village and called the police. The officer who answered sounded unconcerned. Children wandered off all the time on coasts. They'd send someone out, organize a proper search in the morning. In the morning, Eddie wanted to scream. His grandson was out there somewhere, alone, frightened, and they were talking about mourning. But what could he do? This was Greece, not England. He had no power here, no leverage. He drove back to the farmhouse and told his family what the police had said. Christine's face crumpled. Stephen punched the wall. And somewhere in that gathering darkness, in the olive groves or the scrubland or somewhere none of them could imagine, Ben Needham's story was ending before it had barely begun. Carrie Needham's world shattered the moment she saw her mother's face. Christine was standing outside the farmhouse, surrounded by neighbors and police officers, and the expression she wore told Carrie everything before words could. "Where is he?" Carrie demanded, grabbing her mother's arms. "Where's Ben?" Christine couldn't answer. She just shook her head, tears streaming down her face, and Carrie felt something inside her crack open. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. She'd kissed him goodbye that morning. He'd waved at her, said mama in that way he did, half word, half music. That couldn't have been the last time. The police had arrived an hour earlier, 2 officers in a dusty patrol car who parked at the end of the lane and walked up with the casual air of men who'd dealt with this before. Lost children on Kos were common enough. Tourists' kids wandering off at beaches, getting separated in crowds. They always turned up. Always. The senior officer, a man in his 50s with a sun-weathered face, asked the standard questions. When did you last see him? What was he wearing? Any medical conditions? Eddie answered mechanically, his voice hollow. White and green shirt, leather sandals. No medical issues. Just a healthy boy who'd been playing 1 minute and gone the next. The officer nodded, made notes. They'd organize a proper search at first light, he said. Get more men, cover the area systematically. In the meantime, check the nearby properties. Ask neighbors if they'd seen anything. Eddie wanted to grab the man by his collar and shake him. First light? His grandson was out there now, in the dark, possibly hurt, possibly terrified. But he swallowed the rage, nodded, thanked the officer. What else could he do? When the police left, promising to return in the morning, the family stood in the farmhouse yard, looking at each other with hollow eyes. The night stretched ahead of them, impossible and endless. They didn't sleep. How could they? They stayed at the farmhouse, sitting on the steps, drinking coffee someone had made, staring into the darkness and listening for any sound that might be Ben. Christine kept walking the perimeter, calling his name softly, as if he might be sleeping nearby and she'd wake him. Eddie chain-smoked, something he hadn't done in years. Stephen sat with his head in his hands, replaying those last moments on the moped over and over. He'd looked back. He'd seen Ben. How could that have been the last time? Carrie paced. She couldn't sit still, couldn't accept the passive act of waiting. She wanted to search, to do something, anything, but where? The darkness was absolute out here, away from the village lights. You could walk 5 meters and lose your bearings. Still, she tried. She took a flashlight and walked down the lane, sweeping the beam across the olive groves, calling Ben's name until her voice gave out. A neighbor eventually guided her back, his hand gentle on her shoulder. "You must rest," he said in broken English. "The police will find him tomorrow." Carrie nodded, but she didn't believe him. A feeling had settled in her chest, cold and heavy. Something terrible had happened. She didn't know what, didn't have words for it yet, but she knew. Mothers knew. Dawn came slowly, the sky lightening from black to gray to pale blue. With it came more police, more volunteers. The search expanded from the immediate farmhouse area to the surrounding groves, to the lanes, to the coast 1/2 kilometer away. Men and women walked in lines, calling Ben's name, checking under bushes, behind walls, inside abandoned buildings. Search dogs arrived, German shepherds straining at their leashes, but the heat and the dry ground made scent tracking difficult. One dog showed interest near the excavator, circling the area where Ben had been playing, but then lost the trail. Another indicated toward the lane, but again, nothing conclusive. The officers in charge conferred, shook their heads. The child had vanished without a trace. By the afternoon of July 25th, a new theory was taking shape. If Ben wasn't found nearby, and clearly, he wasn't, then he must have been taken, abducted. It was the only explanation that made sense. A toddler couldn't walk far enough on his own to be this thoroughly lost. Someone had to have picked him up, put him in a vehicle, driven away. The timing was suspect too. That narrow window when the adults were distracted, when Stephen had left on the moped and Christine was inside. 5, maybe 10 minutes. Someone watching could have seen the opportunity and taken it. The question was, who? The whispers started almost immediately. Roma travelers. Gypsies. There was a camp about 15 kilometers away, and everyone knew they moved around, didn't stay in one place. Easy to take a child, easy to disappear. The police began making inquiries, visiting the camp, questioning families. The interviews were tense, confrontational. The Roma protested their innocence, said they knew nothing about a missing English boy, but the suspicion clung to them anyway. For Carrie and her family, the theory offered something worse than terror. It offered hope. If Ben had been taken, he was alive. Somewhere out there he was breathing, crying maybe, but alive. They could find him. They would find him. The media picked up the story on the 3rd day. British boy missing in Greece. Newspapers ran his photo. A smiling Ben with his blonde hair and blue eyes, that strawberry birthmark visible on his neck in one particular shot. The BBC covered it briefly. Missing posters went up around Kos, then across Greece. Tips started coming in almost immediately. A woman in Thessaloniki saw a boy matching the description at a market. A taxi driver in Athens picked up a couple with a blonde toddler who seemed distressed. A shopkeeper in Crete served a family where the child looked wrong somehow. Too well dressed, too quiet. Every single lead had to be checked. Every single one turned out to be nothing. Carrie threw herself into the search with manic energy. She visited the Roma camp herself, ignoring the hostile looks, showing Ben's picture to anyone who would look. She spoke to journalists, begged them to keep the story alive. She called the British consulate daily, demanding they do more, pressure the Greek authorities, send resources. The consular officials were polite but firm. This was Greek jurisdiction. The British government could offer support, but they couldn't interfere. Carrie hung up on them more than once. What the family didn't know, what wouldn't become clear until years later, was how badly the initial investigation had failed them. The police hadn't alerted the airports and ferry ports until nearly 24 hours after Ben disappeared. A full day. In that time, someone could have taken him off Kos, off Greece entirely. The farmhouse wasn't treated as a crime scene because technically, no crime had been confirmed. Renovation work resumed within a week. The excavator continued moving earth. Vehicles drove over the site. Any potential evidence, footprints, fabric fibers, anything, was ground into dust or buried under fresh spoil. The investigation was operating on the assumption of abduction, which meant the focus was outward, toward borders and roads and camps. No one was looking at the ground beneath their feet. By August, a month after the disappearance, the active search had wound down. The police maintained that the case was open, that they were following leads, but the daily searches had stopped. The volunteers had returned to their lives. The farmhouse was empty again, except for the wind and the heat. Carrie and her family stayed on course, unable to leave, unable to accept that Ben might not be found. They lived in a strange, suspended state, neither moving forward nor backward, just existing in the space between fear and hope. Christine barely spoke anymore. Eddie had aged 10 years in a month. Stephen couldn't look at the farmhouse without feeling sick, and Carrie made a decision. She would not let Ben become a statistic. She would not let the world forget him. Whatever it took, however long it took, she would find out what happened to her son. The years after Ben's disappearance moved like sludge, slow, heavy, impossible to escape. Carrie eventually returned to England in late 1992, her savings exhausted, her body depleted, but her resolve unbroken. She rented a small flat in Sheffield, similar to the one she'd fled 2 years earlier, except now Ben's toys were packed in boxes stacked against the wall. She couldn't bring herself to put them away properly. That would mean accepting he wasn't coming back. So they stayed there, visible reminders of the life that had been stolen from both of them. She kept his room ready. It was absurd, she knew. He'd been 21 months old when he disappeared, and even if, when he came back, he'd be older, different. But the room stayed frozen, the crib, the mobile hanging above it, the stuffed animals arranged on the shelf. Friends suggested gently that maybe she should redecorate, use the space for something else. Carrie's response was always the same. He's coming home. I need it to be ready. The conversations usually ended there. Finding work was difficult. Employers asked about gaps in her employment history, and Carrie couldn't lie convincingly. When she told the truth, my son went missing in Greece, I was searching for him, their expressions shifted from curiosity to pity to discomfort. Pity she could handle. The discomfort was worse. It made her a problem, a reminder of things people didn't want to think about. She cycled through jobs, retail, cleaning, waitressing. Nothing stuck. Her mind was always elsewhere, always in Greece, always on July 24, 1991. The sightings continued, though less frequently than in the first year. 1995 brought a report from Morocco, a street child with blonde hair spotted by a British tourist. Carrie scraped together money for the flight, spent 3 days in Marrakesh following leads that evaporated like mirages. The child, when finally located, was Moroccan, his hair bleached by sun and malnutrition. Not Ben. 1998, Bulgaria. An orphanage director contacted the British Embassy about a boy with no documented history. Carrie was there within a week. The boy was the right age, the right coloring. Her heart hammered as she walked into the room where he was playing. But when he looked up, she knew immediately. Wrong eyes, wrong smile, not Ben. She cried on the flight home, the kind of deep, shuddering sobs that embarrassed other passengers but couldn't be stopped. 2001 brought Romania. A teenager this time, found working in a factory with no memory of his early childhood. The authorities thought he might be British based on fragments of English he spoke. Carrie flew to Bucharest, took a train to a gray industrial town, sat across from a 16-year-old boy who studied her with wary eyes. I'm looking for my son, she said through a translator. He was taken when he was a baby. The boy shook his head slowly. I don't remember being a baby, he said. They did a DNA test anyway. Negative. Of course it was negative. It was always negative. The family fractured under the weight of it. Eddie and Christine had returned to England shortly after Carrie, settling in a different part of Sheffield. They tried to resume normal life, but guilt had calcified into something harder. Whose fault was it that Ben disappeared? The turn of the millennium came and went. Ben would have been 10 years old. Carrie commissioned an age progression image, working with a forensic artist to imagine what her son might look like now. The resulting sketch showed a boy with sandy hair and a cautious smile, wearing the kind of generic clothing the artist had pulled from current fashion catalogs. Carrie stared at the image for hours. It looked like a child. It didn't look like Ben. How could it? She didn't know who Ben would have become. She didn't know if he was alive to become anyone. By 2006, Carrie had begun to accept something she'd resisted for years. No one was looking for Ben anymore. The Greek case file was technically open, but no one was actively working it. The British authorities had provided initial support, and then moved on to newer, more urgent cases. The media had long since forgotten the blonde toddler who vanished on Kos. Carrie's annual appeals for information generated brief articles in local papers, maybe a segment on regional news, but nothing substantial. Ben had become a cold case, a tragedy filed away and gathering dust. The world had moved on. Carrie couldn't. Then came May 3rd, 2007. A little girl named Madeleine McCann disappeared from a holiday apartment in Praia da Luz, Portugal. She was 3 years old, blonde-haired, blue-eyed. Within hours, the story dominated every news channel. Within days, celebrities were appealing for information. Within weeks, a multi-million-pound investigation fund had been established. The British government applied diplomatic pressure on Portugal. The Pope mentioned Madeleine in a public prayer. The world, it seemed, had stopped to search for this one missing child. Carrie watched the coverage with a feeling she couldn't quite name. It wasn't jealousy. She would never wish this nightmare on another family. But it was something close to anger. Where was this response when Ben disappeared? Where were the celebrities, the funding, the diplomatic pressure? Ben had been even younger than Madeleine, even more vulnerable. Yet his case had been handled with a fraction of the resources, a fraction of the urgency. The more Carrie watched, the clearer the pattern became. The McCanns were articulate, educated, middle-class professionals. Kate McCann was a GP. Jerry was a consultant cardiologist. They knew how to navigate systems, how to speak to media, how to apply pressure in the right places. The Needhams were working class, with no connections, no leverage, no voice that anyone felt compelled to hear. The realization was bitter but galvanizing. Carrie couldn't change the past, couldn't retroactively give Ben the investigation he deserved in 1991. But she could use the McCann case as leverage. Every interview about Madeleine became an opportunity to mention Ben. Every article about missing children became a platform to highlight the disparity in resources. "Why is my son worth less?" she asked reporters directly. "We're both British families. Both our children were taken abroad. Why does one case get millions in funding while the other gets nothing?" The questions were uncomfortable. They forced people to confront biases they didn't want to acknowledge. Class mattered. Perception mattered. The right kind of victim got resources. The wrong kind got sympathy and silence. Carrie hammered this point relentlessly, writing letters to MPs, to the Home Office, to journalists who would listen. She was no longer just a grieving mother. She was an activist, a thorn in the side of a system that wanted her to quietly go away. In 2009, something shifted. The Home Secretary, under pressure from media scrutiny and persistent campaigning, announced that funding would be allocated for a dedicated British police investigation into Ben Needham's disappearance. South Yorkshire Police would lead the operation. Detective Inspector John Cousins, who had been following the case for years from the margins, was assigned as lead investigator. Carrie received the news with cautious relief. 18 years. It had taken 18 years to get here, but finally, someone official was going to look for her son. Cousins was methodical, patient, and skeptical of everything he'd been told. His first action was to request the complete Greek case file, all witness statements, all evidence reports. What he received shocked him. The investigation had been superficial, almost negligent. The farmhouse had never been properly forensically examined. The excavator driver, Konstantinos Barkas, had been interviewed briefly in 1991 but never followed up with. The timeline of July 24th had never been rigorously reconstructed. Most damning of all, no one had seriously considered the possibility that Ben hadn't been abducted at all. Everyone had assumed he'd been taken. No one had asked, what if he never left? Cousins flew to Kos and walked the site. The farmhouse had changed. An extension had been built, the landscape altered by 2 decades of use, but the basic geography remained. He stood where Christine Needham had stood, looking out at the area where Ben had been playing. He measured distances, calculated sight lines. Then he looked at the excavator's operational zone. A toddler, 21 months old, would have been what? Waist-high to an adult? Lower than the excavator's blind spots? Cousins felt something cold settle in his stomach. This wasn't an abduction site. This was an accident site, and everyone had been looking in the wrong direction for 20 years. In October 2012, Cousins organized a preliminary excavation. Cadaver dogs were brought in, ground-penetrating radar deployed. The technology was far superior to what had been available in 1991, but the challenge remained. 21 years of earth movement, construction, and decomposition. The dogs showed interest in several areas, but nothing conclusive. The radar picked up anomalies, but anomalies could be anything. Old foundations, buried debris, natural variations in soil density. On the third day, an officer sifting soil by hand found something. A fragment of leather, small, shaped. Analysis confirmed it. A child's sandal, consistent with early 1990s style. It had been buried approximately 1.2 meters down, in a layer that corresponded roughly to the period of Ben's disappearance. Carrie was shown a photograph. Ben had sandals like that, she said quietly. They attempted DNA extraction, but the material was too degraded. The result was inconclusive. Still, it was proof of concept. Items from 1991 could be recovered. If there was evidence, it could be found. They just had to know where to look. The answer came 3 years later from the last person anyone expected. In the summer of 2015, South Yorkshire Police coordinated with Greek authorities for a televised appeal. The broadcast went out across Greece, showing age-progressed images of Ben, explaining the timeline, making a direct appeal. If you know anything about what happened to Ben Needham, please come forward. We believe this may have been an accident. No one is looking to assign blame. We just want the truth. The tip line received dozens of calls, most of them well-meaning but useless. But one call stood out. The man wouldn't give his name. "Call me Viper," he said. And then he told them about Konstantinos Barkas. Detective Inspector John Cousins sat in a windowless interview room in a police station on Kos, listening to a voice on speakerphone. The man who called himself Viper spoke Greek, his words translated by an officer beside Cousins. The story came slowly, haltingly, as if the speaker was fighting against his own reluctance. "I knew Dino Konstantinos Barkas for many years," Viper said. "We drank together, worked together sometimes. Good man, you understand? Not a criminal." Cousins said nothing. Let the silence do its work. After a long pause, Viper continued. "One night, late 90s maybe, he was drunk, very drunk. Started crying. I thought it was his wife. They'd been fighting. But he said, 'I killed a child.'" Cousins felt his pulse quicken but kept his voice neutral. What exactly did he say? Viper's answer came in fragments. Barkas had been operating the excavator at a farmhouse in Iraklis. July, 91. Hot day. He'd been moving earth, building spoil, doing his job. He saw something in his peripheral vision, thought it was a toy, maybe a doll someone had left out. Felt a small bump, kept working. It was only later, when the family started shouting, searching, when the police came, that he realized what he'd done. The English boy. He'd run over the English boy. "Why didn't he say anything?" Cousins demanded. Viper's response was bitter. He panicked. "You understand? He had a family. He thought he'd go to prison. So he put the body in a load of rubble, took it to the dump site, buried it deep." Another pause. "He carried that his whole life. It destroyed him." Cousins asked the crucial question. "Where is Barkas now? Can we speak with him?" The silence that followed was answer enough before Viper spoke. "Dino died, earlier this year. Cancer." Cousins closed his eyes. Konstantinos Barkas had died in January 2015, 4 months before this phone call, 6 months before the television appeal that had finally loosened Viper's tongue. The one person who could have confirmed or denied the story, who could have led them directly to Ben's remains, was gone. "Can you come in?" Cousins asked. "Make an official statement?" but Viper had already hung up. The investigation pivoted immediately. Cousins and his team began mapping the farmhouse site as it had existed in 1991. They obtained employment records confirming Barkas had indeed been working there on July 24th. They interviewed his family, who reacted with outrage and denial. "Our father was a good man," Barkas's daughter insisted, her voice shaking with anger. "A careful operator, religious. He would never have hidden something like that." But Cousins had learned to distrust certainty. People hid things. Good people hid terrible things. And Barkas's behavior in the years following Ben's disappearance showed patterns consistent with guilt: increased drinking, depression, withdrawal from his community. The dump site became the focus. Using satellite imagery from multiple years, Cousins' team identified the location where Barkas would have deposited spoil from the farmhouse renovation. It was 750 meters northwest, in what had been an olive grove but had become an informal landfill by the mid-90s. The area was now overgrown, partially reclaimed by vegetation, but core samples confirmed it had been actively used in the early 90s. "If Viper is telling the truth," Cousins said at a briefing, "Ben Needham is in that dump." In September 2016, the largest excavation in the case's history began. Two sites were targeted simultaneously: the farmhouse, where the accident allegedly occurred, and the dump, where the body was allegedly hidden. The operation required delicate diplomacy. The current farmhouse owners were sympathetic but understandably reluctant to have their property torn apart. A compromise was reached. The team could excavate, but they'd need to partially demolish an extension that had been built directly over the target area post-1991. Costs were mounting: equipment, personnel, logistics. The UK government had approved £800,000 for the operation. Cousins intended to use every penny. Carrie flew to Kos and stood at the perimeter of the site, watching earth-moving equipment position itself where her son had last been seen alive. She'd been told to prepare for the possibility they might not find anything. Decomposition over 25 years could completely eliminate skeletal remains, especially in certain soil conditions. "But if he's there," Cousins told her gently, "we'll find something. Some trace of him." Carrie nodded, unable to trust her voice. She'd lived in hope for so long that the prospect of confirmation felt surreal. Part of her still expected Ben to walk toward her, 26 years old now, with an explanation for where he'd been. The rational part knew better. The excavation was archaeological in precision. The site was divided into grid squares, each one excavated by hand, every bucket of soil sifted. Forensic officers worked in the brutal September heat, protected by canopies but still sweltering. Artifacts emerged regularly: bottle caps, rusty nails, fragments of pottery, pieces of fabric too degraded to identify. Each item was catalogued, photographed, analyzed. Days passed. Then a week. The team at the farmhouse found nothing definitive. The extension's foundation had disturbed the original ground layer, making stratigraphic analysis difficult. If something was there, it had been disrupted, possibly destroyed. The dump site offered more promise. The soil there had been less disturbed, and the depth of the landfill meant that the 1991 layer was relatively intact beneath years of subsequent dumping. On the 9th day, a forensic officer named Sarah Mitchell was working quadrant D7 when her trowel struck something solid. She cleared the surrounding soil carefully, using a soft brush to expose the object. It was small, yellow, plastic. As she cleaned it, details emerged: wheels, windows, the unmistakable shape of a toy car. Mitchell felt her stomach tighten. She called over the supervisor, who called Cousins, who called the family liaison officer. Carrie was brought to the edge of the excavation pit. They wouldn't let her climb down, evidence protocols, but they held up the object for her to see. The toy car, still caked with dirt but recognizable, sat in a clear evidence bag. "Do you recognize this?" the liaison officer asked. Carrie's vision blurred. She nodded, unable to speak. When she finally found her voice, it came out broken. "That's Ben's car. He had that exact car. He loved that car." Around her, the team exchanged glances. They'd found the link: victim to location. Ben's toy, buried at the dump site Barkas had used, at a depth consistent with 1991. The circumstantial case was complete. But the excavation wasn't over. If the car was here, Ben might be nearby. The team expanded the grid around the discovery point, sifting through cubic meter after cubic meter of soil. They found more artifacts from the era. A glass bottle with a date stamp of 90. A newspaper fragment too degraded to read. A rusted tool. No bones, no fabric, no human remains. The soil analysis came back with a mix of results. Certain areas showed elevated pH levels that could indicate decomposition, but they were inconclusive. The limestone-heavy soil of Kos had a natural alkalinity that could produce false positives. As the second week drew to a close, the operation's budget limit approached. Cousins made the difficult decision to scale back. They'd excavated to bedrock in the most promising areas, sifted thousands of kilograms of soil, deployed every technological resource available. The toy car was a triumph, but it wasn't enough. Not for the family, not for the case file. On September 29th, Cousins held a press conference. The assembled journalists waited with cameras ready as he stepped to the podium, Carrie seated behind him, her face a mask of controlled emotion. After 5 weeks of intensive investigation, Cousins began, "It is my professional belief that Ben Needham died on July 24, 1991, as a result of an accident involving heavy machinery near the farmhouse where he was last seen. I believe his remains were subsequently moved to a secondary location with building spoil and buried. Despite exhaustive efforts, we have not recovered his body. However, the evidence we have gathered, witness testimony, the recovery of his toy at the dump site, and forensic analysis, strongly supports this conclusion. The investigation remains open, but active excavation has concluded." The questions came immediately. What about the family? Would anyone be prosecuted? How certain was he? Cousins fielded them with weary patience. The family deserved answers, and he'd given them the truth as best he could determine it. Prosecution was impossible. The primary suspect was dead, and the statute of limitations had expired years ago. As for certainty, he was as certain as one could be without a body. The evidence pointed in one direction. Everything else was speculation. Carrie's statement was brief. "I've spent 25 years believing Ben was alive somewhere. Maybe with another family. Maybe with no memory of me. Now I'm being told he died the day he disappeared. That he never left Kos. That he was buried like rubbish. But without his body, without proof, how am I supposed to accept that? How am I supposed to mourn him when there's still a chance, however small, that everyone is wrong?" Her voice broke. She didn't finish. She didn't need to. The pain was self-evident. The toy car and the sandal fragment were sent to the James Hutton Institute in Aberdeen, Scotland. Professor Lorna Dawson, a renowned forensic soil scientist, specialized in chemical profiling, analyzing soil for markers of decomposition. Her team subjected both artifacts to intensive testing, looking for volatile fatty acids, nitrogen compounds, specific chemical signatures that human remains produced as they broke down. The process took months, painstaking work at the molecular level. In March 2018, Dawson's preliminary report arrived. Both items showed chemical profiles consistent with proximity to a decomposing human body. The markers weren't conclusive enough for courtroom-level proof, but they strongly suggested that human remains had been present in the soil where these objects were buried. Cousins felt a wave of vindication. The accident theory wasn't just plausible, it was supported by science. He called Carrie with the update. Her response was cautious. Chemical markers. Not bones, not DNA, just chemicals. She wasn't wrong to be skeptical, but it was progress. The DNA work proceeded separately. Biologists examined the toy car under high magnification and found traces of what appeared to be blood on the undercarriage, in crevices where dirt and moisture had preserved organic material. Extraction was possible, though the sample was degraded. The process was delicate, requiring months of careful work. Finally, in November 2018, the laboratory generated a complete DNA profile from the blood. It was clean, usable, ready for comparison. They ran it against Ben's reference sample, the Guthrie card, the heel prick blood spot taken when he was born in 1989. The database hummed, algorithms comparing loci, building probability matrices. The result came back clear. No match. The blood on the toy car was human, but it wasn't Ben Needham's. Cousins read the report 3 times, unable to process it. How was this possible? The car was Ben's. Carrie had confirmed it. It was found at the dump site Barkas used, buried at a depth corresponding to 1991. The chemical markers indicated decomposition, but the DNA said the blood belonged to someone else. Who? When? Why? He called the laboratory, demanded they double-check. They did. The result didn't change. Human blood, not Ben's. When Carrie heard, she didn't cry. She just sat in her Sheffield flat, staring at the wall, feeling something inside her collapse. They'd given her an answer. Then they'd taken it away. The toy car was supposed to be proof. It was supposed to close the door on hope and let her grieve. Instead, it had opened more questions. Whose blood was on the car? Could Ben still be alive? Had the police been wrong about everything? In 2019, Cousins retired. He'd given the case everything he had, exhausted every lead, deployed every resource. But Ben Needham had defeated him, not through lack of effort, but through the simple, brutal fact that some mysteries can't be solved by methodology alone. Sometimes the evidence just isn't there. Sometimes the truth is buried too deep, degraded too far, lost too completely. He thought of Carrie often after retiring, wondered if she'd ever find peace. He doubted it. How could she? When the case refused to offer clarity, the law had nothing to offer the Needham family. Even if Konstantinos Barkas had been alive in 2016 when Viper came forward, even if he'd confessed in a signed statement witnessed by a dozen officers, Greek law would have shielded him. The statute of limitations for manslaughter, the charge that would have applied to an accidental death involving machinery, was 20 years. Carrie Needham turned 53 in October 2024. She marked the occasion quietly, alone in her flat, the same flat she'd lived in for decades. Ben would have been 35. She tried to imagine what he'd look like, who he'd have become, but the image wouldn't come. The age progression sketches had stopped being useful years ago. They showed generic men with vague features, composites that could have been anyone. She kept them anyway, filed in a box with newspaper clippings and police reports and the hundreds of letters she'd written to authorities over the years. Her relationship with her parents remained strained. Eddie and Christine were in their 80s now, health failing, time running out. They'd accepted the police's conclusion years ago, believed Ben had died on that farmhouse site. "We've made our peace with it," Christine told Carrie during a difficult conversation in 2022. "You should too." But Carrie couldn't. Making peace felt like betrayal, like abandoning Ben to uncertainty. As long as the case was technically open, as long as sightings were still being investigated, she couldn't declare him dead. Not definitively. Not in her heart. Stephen called every year on Ben's birthday, the same awkward conversation they'd had for decades. He'd been 17 when it happened. He was 51 now, living in Barcelona with a partner Carrie had never met, working in construction, speaking Spanish more fluently than English. "I still see him," Stephen said during the 2024 call, his voice thick with emotion. "Every time I see a little kid playing in dirt, I see Ben. I see him looking up at me when I got on that moped. I should have stayed. I should have." Carrie cut him off gently. They'd had this conversation before. Guilt was pointless. No one could have predicted what happened, not even the person who'd caused it. In July 2024, a new lead emerged. An email arrived at South Yorkshire Police from a man in Denmark claiming to be Ben Needham. He was in his 30s, had gaps in his family history, bore a resemblance to the age progression images. The claim was plausible enough to warrant investigation. DNA testing was arranged. Carrie allowed herself a flicker of hope, the dangerous, familiar kind that had burned her so many times before. The results came back in September. Negative. Not Ben. Just another person looking for identity in someone else's tragedy. The U.S. sighting came 3 months later. An anonymous email claiming Ben had been seen in the United States in late 1991 or early 92. The details were vague. A blonde child in the company of an older couple, speaking with a British accent, possibly in the Midwest. South Yorkshire Police confirmed they were investigating, but 8 months passed with no updates. Carrie's frustration boiled over. "If they truly believe he's dead," she told a journalist, "why are they still chasing sightings? They can't have it both ways. Either they're certain or they're not." But the police had no choice. The case was open. Credible leads had to be investigated, regardless of how remote the possibility. The legacy of Ben's case extended beyond his family. Policy changes had rippled through the UK's approach to missing children investigations. The Golden Hour Protocol, immediate, full-scale response to missing children reports, was now standard, regardless of the family's background or the circumstances of disappearance. Border alerts were automatic within 30 minutes. Crime scenes were preserved even when a crime hadn't been confirmed. The Needham case had been a textbook example of everything done wrong. It became required reading in police training programs, a cautionary tale of complacency and assumption. The biobanking of neonatal samples, once optional, was now standard practice across the EU. Ben's Guthrie card had enabled every DNA comparison over the years. Without it, ruling out false leads would have been impossible. Professor Dawson's work on chemical markers advanced significantly from the Ben case. Her techniques now standard in cold case investigations involving potential burial sites. Ground-penetrating radar had improved. Cadaver dog training had evolved. Forensic soil science had expanded. Ben's disappearance had inadvertently pushed the field forward, though Carrie found no comfort in that. Progress built on her son's bones, or lack thereof, felt grotesque. The class disparity exposed by the McCann-Needham comparison remained a subject of debate. Academic papers analyzed media coverage patterns, resource allocation in missing persons cases, the implicit biases that determined which victims received attention. Carrie had become a reluctant expert on the subject, speaking at conferences, consulting on policy reviews. No child should be worth more than another, she said repeatedly. But they are. We all know they are. And until we admit that, nothing changes. In February 2025, Carrie received a package from Greece. Inside was a small wooden box, hand-carved, with a note from a woman named Maria Barkas, Konstantinos' widow. The note was brief. "I've carried this since my husband died. I don't know if he did what they say. I don't want to believe it. But if your son is out there, in the earth, then maybe these prayers will help him rest. I'm sorry. I don't know what else to give you." Inside the box was a rosary and a photograph of the farmhouse as it had looked in the early 90s, before the extension, before everything changed. Carrie held the rosary and felt something she hadn't expected. Sympathy for Maria Barkas, another woman destroyed by July 24, 1991. The 30th anniversary of Ben's disappearance, July 2021, had brought renewed media attention. The BBC produced a documentary. Podcasts revisited the case. Age progression artists created new images, though they were guesswork at best. Carrie participated in some interviews, declined others. She was tired. Not tired of searching, but tired of explaining why she couldn't stop. People wanted closure for her, wanted her to mourn and move on and live her life. They didn't understand. This was her life. Ben's absence was the organizing principle around which everything else revolved. She'd never married, never had other children. Friends had encouraged both over the years, gently suggesting that maybe another child would help, that maybe companionship would ease the loneliness, but Carrie couldn't imagine it. Replacing Ben felt obscene. And what man would want to enter a relationship with a woman who kept a shrine to a missing child, who flew to Greece or Romania or Denmark at a moment's notice, who couldn't talk about the future because she was trapped in 1991? She'd had brief relationships, but they always ended the same way. The man would eventually ask, "Can't you let him go?" And Carrie would answer, "No." That was usually the end. Ben's room remained unchanged. The crib was gone now. Carrie had finally accepted that a 30-something man wouldn't need it if he returned. But his toys were still there, the photographs still on the wall. The yellow toy car's absence was conspicuous, an empty space on the shelf where it should have been. That car sat in an evidence locker in Sheffield, permanently marked as Exhibit A in a case that would never go to trial. Carrie had requested its return multiple times. The answer was always the same. The case was still open. Evidence couldn't be released. In her darkest moments, Carrie wondered if she'd wasted her life, 34 years chasing a ghost, 34 years refusing to accept what everyone else believed. That Ben died in 5 minutes of inattention, crushed by machinery, buried in panic. The evidence pointed to it. The science supported it. Even her own parents believed it. But belief required proof, and proof required a body. Without Ben's bones in a grave with his name on it, Carrie couldn't surrender. The possibility, however remote, that he was alive somewhere kept her moving forward, or kept her trapped. Sometimes she couldn't tell the difference. The most recent development, the U.S. sighting investigation, exemplified the torture of ambiguity. If the police believed Ben was dead, truly believed it, they wouldn't waste resources on sightings. But they did investigate, which meant doubt remained. And doubt was both hope and poison. Carrie existed in the space between, unable to grieve, unable to celebrate, suspended in a state psychologists called ambiguous loss, grief without closure, mourning without burial. Support groups existed for families like hers, people whose loved ones had vanished without trace. Carrie attended occasionally, found temporary comfort in shared experience, but ultimately, everyone's pain was unique. No one else had her specific burden. In a statement released on the 34th anniversary, July 2025, Carrie articulated what she'd learned. People think closure means knowing what happened, but I know what probably happened. Police have told me. The evidence suggests it. But knowledge without proof is just theory. And I can't bury a theory. I can't mourn a probability. Until I hold my son's bones, until I can lay him to rest properly, he exists in the space between life and death. Some people call that denial. I call it being his mother. I brought him into this world. I owe him the certainty of knowing he left it, and until I have that, I'll keep searching. The yellow toy car sits in its evidence bag, labeled and cataloged, bearing DNA that belongs to no one the investigation has identified. The chemical markers suggest death. The absence of matching DNA suggests mystery. The farmhouse in Iraklis has been renovated again, its secrets buried under concrete and tile. The dump site has been reclaimed by olive trees, nature erasing human scars. Konstantinos Barkas rests in a cemetery outside Kos, his gravestone bearing no mention of the burden he allegedly carried. And somewhere in all that earth, or nowhere, or somewhere unimaginable, Ben Needham waits to be found. Carrie Needham turned 54. Ben, if alive, turned 35. The age progression images become increasingly abstract at this point. Educated guesses about genetics and environment producing faces that could belong to anyone. Carrie keeps them anyway, adds them to the box with the others. The archive of a life spent searching. She knows how this looks from the outside. Obsessive, unhealthy, a woman unable to accept reality. But from the inside, it's simpler. She's a mother, her child is missing. The world may have declared the case resolved but unsolved, may have filed Ben away as a historical tragedy. But to Carrie, he's not history. He's her son. And she'll look for him until the day she dies, or until the day someone proves, definitively, scientifically, beyond doubt, that he's been dead all along. The truth about Ben Needham is both known and unknown. Science says chemicals of death. DNA says not Ben. Witness says accident and burial. Evidence says toy car and dump. The pieces exist, but they don't form a complete picture, don't answer the only question that matters. Where is he? Until that question has an answer, until uncertainty resolves into fact, the case remains what it's always been. A mystery wrapped in probability, a tragedy suspended in time, a family frozen in July 1991, waiting for the moment they can finally, mercifully, move forward. What do you think happened to Ben Needham? Was it truly an accident, buried beneath decades of Greek soil? Or is there another explanation the investigation missed? The evidence points in one direction, but the DNA tells a different story. After 34 years, the mystery endures. Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if this case moved you, subscribe to stay updated on the world's most compelling unsolved mysteries. Some stories demand to be remembered. Some children deserve to be found. Ben Needham is both.